Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Chris Martin, and I am the Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. I want to thank you so much for joining us today for the fifth panel in our series, Decolonization in Focus. This series is now in its third year, having previously centered around themes of race and intersectionality. The series has received generous sponsorship from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and from peer centers throughout the US. I invite all of our viewers to view all 6 panels, which have been scheduled throughout February and March, and each session has been or will be live streamed and recorded for future viewing in case you should miss any. Now, before we start, I want to recognize my colleagues, Zuzana Magdo from the University of Pittsburgh, and today, Kat Green from the Davis Center, who have been instrumental in developing and implementing this series. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our institutional sponsors, including our peer regional studies centers at the Universities of Chicago, Wisconsin-Madison, Kansas, Michigan, Texas at Austin, California, Berkeley, as well as The Ohio State University, UNC Chapel Hill, Indiana University Bloomington, and George Washington University for their support. Last but not least, our gratitude also goes out today to our speakers who are speaking and answering our call and stepping into this conversation, which is so critical for our field. Today's topic is decolonization, syllabus design, and critical pedagogies in the classroom. How do we teach differently? And I should say that the plan for today's session has been adapted slightly as Lewis Porter will not be able to join us as planned. And given that we now only have 2 panelists, we have decided to shorten the session to an hour instead of an hour and a half. We would also like to make the conversation today really conversational and not just a one-way presentation. So to that end, we really encourage you, the audience, to share your questions and comments via the Zoom Q&A function early and often. Any questions posted to YouTube will be also shared with us by our staff here. Your questions and general feedback will provide fodder for the conversation between our 2 panelists today, who I will now introduce. With us today, we have Karas Shank, who's an associate professor of political science at Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan, who is teaching and research expertise in the politics of immigration and national identity in Eurasia. Her book, published with the University of Toronto Press, is called Why Control Immigration: Strategic Uses of Migration Management in Russia. Her current and previous research has been funded by the American Councils for International Education, Nazarbayev University, and the Fulbright Scholar Program, and has been published in Demokratizatsiya, Europe-Asia Studies, and Nationalities papers, and in edited volumes published by Edinburgh University Press and Oxford University Press. Also with us today is Shoshana Keller, who teaches Russian, Soviet, Eurasian, and modern Middle Eastern history. She has taught a survey of Russian Eurasian history from Rurik to Putin for 28 years and teaches courses on the Silk Road, Boris Godunov and the Time of Troubles, and the Soviet Union as a multinational state. She recently published Russia and Central Asia, Coexistence, Conquest, Convergence from Toronto 2020, and has written articles on women, creating historical narratives, and the economics of manual labor in Uzbekistan. Shoshana is working on a mapping project of the many nations of Kazakhstan and a series of podcast conversations about the non-Russian peoples of Eurasia. So we're in good hands today for the conversation we're about to have. Again, a reminder to please put questions and comments for discussion or into the Q&A box. And with that, I'm going to turn things over actually to Shoshana. Thanks so much for being here today.
Okay, so yes, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I found this a very valuable seminar series so far. So today we're focusing on the Vixen question of, okay, we should decolonize, we should get away from our traditional narrative about not only the Russian people, but the Russian state, right? This narrative that we inherited pretty directly from the 1890s with the generation of Russian historians who were refugees from the Bolshevik Revolution and came here. The question is, A, how do we do it? And B, how do we create a narrative in the classroom that both accommodates multiple peoples and multiple perspectives without getting our students hopelessly lost? Right? And this, I think, has been the great challenge. And it's a challenge, I should say, that I'm in the process of figuring out myself how to do. Right now, I'm teaching part 2 of my regular survey. I just ended with World War II right before we broke for spring break. And I have not yet done the early part of the survey, but I'm going to be doing it in the fall. And this is going to be a much more hands-on experimental approach to the survey. So what I want to outline are some of the core principles that I'm thinking about as I'm thinking about restructuring the syllabus, and some, I hope, practical advice on how we can create a new narrative in the classroom that students will still find compelling and comprehensive. So the first thing I think we need to do is, when we start with our survey of the first part of Russian history, is we have to start with Kiev and Russ. As I have looked around at many syllabi available, a lot of my colleagues, for understandable reasons, tend to start later. Right? Most surveys start in the 15th century, which is the post-Mongol period. I've seen a few that even start with Peter the Great. The Kiev and Russian period, Rus period, is messy, it's difficult, but it is vital that we start there, right? Because two reasons. One, of course, the shared root, historical root of today's Russia, today's Ukraine, today's Belarus, all goes back to Kiev and Rus. All three of those states came out of the Kiev and Rus experience. The second reason is that it is in these centuries, I'm talking about roughly the 8th century up to the 13th century, the Mongol conquest in 1240, in fact, laid down some very long-lasting regional political cultures whose existence is going to shape political patterns for many centuries after the end of the Kiev and Rus period. So students need to understand these fundamental political cultures in order to understand how we get the rise of Ukrainians, Belarus, and others as distinct nations in the later centuries. Now, the first problem we run into is textbooks. I have used Walter G. Moss's 2-volume History of Russia for many years. I think it's a great series. Unfortunately, he has not been able to update it since 2003. So I'm still using it right now for my modern half of the survey. I am going to stop using a textbook for the early part of the survey, beginning next fall. The other, of course, very popular survey textbook has long been Nicholas Ryasanovsky's History of Russia. That was updated and added to by Mark Steinberg a number of years ago. Mark did a valiant job, but I'm really afraid that Ryasanovsky is just unsalvageable. It is so much a tale of the rise of both the Russian people and the Russian state as the only story that we can tell about Western Eurasia. And I just don't see using Ryasanovsky at all anymore. We do have other resources, however. There's also a very nice, again, older collection of primary source documents and interpretive essays called Reinterpreting Russian History. This was published in 1994 by Dan Kaiser and Gary Marker. And even though it too is 30 years old, it's a really terrific selection of translations from law codes, from the primary chronicles, from things like graffiti on the walls in Novgorod. The interpretive essays were very well chosen. This, I think, is a book that we can still use, right? If you need some kind of anchoring narrative, I think Reinterpreting Russian History is a good place to go to. So how are we going to do this? Kiev and Rus, back in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, arose not as a Russian state, but as the result of interactions among Eastern Slavs, Scandinavians, of course, the Varangians, Turkic steppe peoples, who we usually call the Pechenegs and the Polovtsi, Finno-Ugric forest dwellers, traders who came from abroad, both Jewish traders crossing Eurasia and Frankish traders, and of course, Greek churchmen after Vladimir brought Rus to Christianity in 988. Through this period, Orthodox Slavs rapidly became the dominant population, right? Even though the ruling dynasty was Scandinavian Viking in origin, we see within 100 years, they're dropping a distinct Scandinavian identity and really becoming fully absorbed into Slavic language, Slavic culture. But we also see from a close look at the chronicle sources and the law codes in particular, that all of these other peoples are not only in the area, they're also living together closely enough and interacting closely enough that we see things like laws forbidding intermarriage between Orthodox Christians and Muslims and Jews. This is where we've got to fight against the sources to an extent, because the churchmen had a big stake in depicting Kiev and Rus as a Christian society, and mostly it was. But Muslim and Jewish and pagan communities were also integral in the society. And this is something that we need to recognize. And I think it's something that is going to resonate with students with our current American emphasis on intersectionality, on the interactions of cultures. This is a way that we can help connect this, history that's very long ago and very far away with interests that I think contemporary American students will appreciate. It is, again, as I said, this period when we see distinctive political cultures being laid down. And this is where I'm going to try and go to sharing my screen with, hang on. All right, so I've got a number of maps up here. And of course, the share screen is blocking out the window that I need. So let me get this down. Hang on. Hey, that is not working. All right, I'm going to stop sharing because I'm not able to see the window with the map that I want to share with you. So if you can find maps of Kiev and Rus on your own, there are plenty of good ones out there. Wikipedia has a really nice map of Kiev and Rus, which is what I was trying to share. So what happens? 11th and 12th centuries, the family that was the governing family of princes of Kiev and Rus. This is not a singular state. This is a bunch of warring city-states, essentially, was spreading further and further out. As there are more princes, they need more land to rule. The group of princes who went west, right, to colonize, not colonize, but really take over and rule the land that today is the borderland between today's Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, the provinces that at the time were called Galicia and Volhynia. The Rus princes who spread to the west encountered an entrenched Polish and Hungarian political culture of strong landed aristocrats who regularly contended with the princes. Right, so the princes were not the dominant power. They always had to negotiate with these strong landed aristocracies. That is a long-term political culture that's going to last for many centuries in that part of the larger Rus cultural area. If we move a little more directly north to the great trading city of Novgorod and its sister city Pskov, we see there a culture where it's the merchant class that has the dominant power, right? And the merchants of Novgorod famously asserted their power over the Rus princes. They regarded the Rus princes as, well, your job is to come and be our military defender, but that's it, right? Otherwise, we run the show, we run the finances, and if we don't like you, we're going to kick you out. So that's yet another distinctive political culture. It's only as the Rus princes spread up into the northeast to the towns of Vladimir, Suzdal, and eventually a small trading post called Moscow, that we see a culture where the prince was the uncontested center of power. Right, and that is, of course, the political culture that eventually will become dominant in what becomes Muscovy. But there's these other political cultures that are extant, and I'm not yet even bringing in the political cultures of the Turkic steppe nomads, who are also important players here. So one of the reasons why people tend to skip over Kiev and Rus is for the perfectly good reason that it is confusing as all get out. It's all of these warring princes. We don't have a centralized state. They never articulated any kind of governing philosophy. So how do you handle this? One good way to do this is to focus on one or two lives of important individuals that illustrate larger patterns. They're already, a good one that we have used for many years is Yaroslav the Wise. Probably the most important prince of 12th century, 11th century Kiev. He laid down some important law codes. We have a lot of material about him. Another good one for the later Kievan period is Prince Mikhail Vsevolodych of Chernihiv, right? Who lived from the 1180s up to 1246. I think he's a good person to use as an illustrator, partly because we have a whole biography written about him by Canadian scholar Martin Dimnick, for which I am grateful, but because Mikhail of Chernihiv's life illustrates a lot of bigger patterns. First of all, the women in the family, very important as connectors for political alliances. Mikhail's mother came from Poland. His wife came from the Western Volhynia region and was clearly had powerful connections there in her own right. His sister and one of his daughters married into the family ruling Susdalia, right? So they're bringing together, right, all of these, this is one common family, but multiple cultural influences in one life. The major reason that we have previously paid attention to Mikhail is because he became a saint. He was murdered at the orders of Mongol conquering Khan Batu in 1246. But if you look closely at the chronicle account, Batu did not personally kill him. It was a couple of Rus warriors who personally killed him. They had signed on with the Mongols. Right, so this illustrates another form of connection. I should also toss in that Mikhail of Chernihiv, Orthodox saint, had marriage ties with the pagan and Muslim Polovets Turkic steppe nomads. And this was not at all uncommon for the princes of Kiev and Russ. They're not only intermarrying with Poles or Hungarians or other Orthodox, they're intermarrying with the Turks as well. Right, this is a world in which the important line is religion, not a sense of ethnicity, not a sense of early nation. And this, again, I think is an important concept for us to emphasize with students, that, you know, our current understanding of the world is so built around the idea of nation, but nations developed in time. Nations are fluid, nations change. And we can see this through the history of the earliest Rus. Okay, moving on from there, and of course, I'm covering a lot of stuff very quickly. Again, how do we create a narrative that is comprehensible once we're at the Mongol conquest? The traditional narrative at 1240 takes a sharp turn to the northeast, and we ask a very teleological question: how did Moscow rise? What I suggest instead is asking much more open-ended questions. What happened to all of the peoples of this vast region after the Mongol conquest destroys Kiev and Rus and now opens the way for new political cultures to develop? One narrative tactic that I think is going to help is to, first of all, lay out two parallel stories, because we've got the rise of the northeast Rus regions, right, the Appanage period, as we call it, that were under direct Mongol rule or indirect Mongol rule, and that's Muscovy itself, Novgorod, Ryazan, Tver. These are all governed from the Golden Horde, from Sarai, down by the Caspian Sea. So that's one narrative that we have to follow. The other one is what happens to the lands around Kiev. Right, Kiev and points to the west. This is Galicia, Volhynia, Smolensk, Polotsk, Kiev itself. They paid tribute to the Khans in early decades, but were never taken under Mongol rule, even indirectly. Instead, what happens to those areas to the west is that they're gradually engulfed by the rising Polish and Lithuanian states. And in this itself is a big, complicated topic. But Lithuania, which was pagan, right, speaking a Baltic language, Poland, a little Western Slavic language, but a strong Roman Catholic power, they gradually engulf a region that is predominantly still Orthodox Christian in its population, but again, had significant Turkic populations and a significant and what will be a growing Jewish population. So I think we need to, first of all, when we're talking about the 13th, the 14th, the 15th centuries, discuss these two narratives in parallel. Right, here's what's happening in the Northeast under Mongol rule, and then here's what's happening in what we can call Ruthenia, right, under more Polish-Lithuanian rule. Then we can turn to emphasizing the connections between these two areas, because even though they pursue distinctive political cultures, the religious and literary cultures remain connected. Even politically, they remain connected. We regularly see princes from Tver, from Moscow, marrying into the ruling houses of Lithuania, right? Much more Lithuania than Poland. That Catholic Orthodox barrier was pretty insurmountable from early on. But strong political and intermarriage ties between the Northeast, what becomes Muscovy, and the Lithuanian and Ruthenia area. And in both areas, the princely family stays the same. So one point of continuity, very much the Orthodox Church. That the Orthodox Church did not give Lithuania its own independent metropolitanate until, I forget the date, the 16th to 17th century, right? They are really, trying very much to hang on to ties across this area. Differences is where things can become interesting, again, with our emphasis on diversity, right? And I'm going to stop here because I see I'm already running out of time. So in the Northeast, what becomes Muscovy, the overwhelming religious culture remains Orthodoxy. We really can't separate religion and state in this period, not until the 17th century, but there remains regular and significant ties with the Turkic Muslim world. Right? As the Mongol Empire falls apart, Muscovy will turn and make itself a successor state, right, to the Golden Horde areas and gradually start absorbing those khanates. So that's very distinctive. Meanwhile, in the West, what happens with the Slavs under Polish and Lithuanian rule, they have to live with a much more religiously diverse area. They have to recognize Catholic Poland and pagan and then later Catholic Lithuania as their superiors. As Poland rises, they become very distinct in the 13th century by inviting in the Jews and creating this large, eventually powerful and politically autonomous Council of the Four Lands, right? Big, important Jewish culture in the West that Muscovy doesn't have. Muscovy does not allow Jews to settle in their territory. And then, because the peoples in Kiev and points west are connected to these big Catholic powers, they will also get kind of the backwash, as it were, of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, of the Reformation, of the Counter-Reformation. And if I could grab a map more easily, I'd show you on the map, the Ottoman Empire is not far away at all from what becomes Ukraine and Belarus. So I'm going to, I do want to leave time for questions. I will end with a completely shameless plug for my own book, because I think this is actually going to be a helpful text in this case, right? So this is called Russia and Central Asia, Toronto Press, right? Great press. I wrote this as an accessible textbook for undergraduates. And what I tried to do was focus on the intertwining across some 800 years of Russian culture with the many peoples across Central Asia, Tatars out to Kyrgyzstan. The first two chapters cover the early period. Most of it does cover the modern and Soviet periods. But I think it is a text that will help us in creating a multinational narrative that is no longer so centered on Russia and on the Russian state. And so I will leave it at that and turn to Caress.
Thank you, Shoshana. That was very interesting. I learned a lot. So I appreciate your perspective on the historical. I'm going to go a little bit east and a little bit more perhaps contemporary by talking about my experience in teaching politics in Kazakhstan. So I'm American by background, born, bred, lived in America until I moved to Kazakhstan 11 years ago, and have learned a lot from my students and from the context in Kazakhstan. So let me, some of these things I think are just kind of pedagogically general things that probably are ways that we can help make our teaching practices decolonized in whatever spaces we find ourselves. And some of them are specific to Kazakhstan's positionality, but I think can also help us as we're thinking about teaching Eurasian politics. So the first thing that I'll say is that when we're talking about non-Russian Eurasian spaces, there's often a double decolonization that needs to happen. And that double decolonization is certainly from Western perspectives, kind of Western hegemonic ideas about knowledge production, about what knowledge counts. So one of the things that I've been doing recently is color coding my syllabi. And this is just a way of like, white Western males get one color, females get another color, let's see, minorities get another color, and Eurasians get another color. It's not a perfect system, but it's just a visual cue to keep myself accountable and to also show my students where are the sources of knowledge that we're pulling on. And it's caused me to really change the things that I assign to students, because I want to kind of get away from those white men. We call them the white turkeys, which is really no offense, but to get away from those white male voices, creating knowledge about Kazakhstanis for themselves, as if that makes any sort of sense. And I think that this is this is not something that we can just do, in Eurasian space. This is something that I think in critical studies, in critical scholarship, showing students what is orthodox is fine. But showing that, but actually like flipping things around to show them what the critical perspectives are first, and then teaching orthodoxies through critical perspectives, I think could be an interesting way to kind of shake up knowledge. Because one of the tensions I think that we find in critical studies is that, we want to teach critical perspectives, but we also want to give our students the ability to go out and be credible voices in society. And if they don't know the sort of orthodoxies that they're speaking against, sometimes that can be a little bit difficult, and it can be a little bit discrediting. So we definitely want them to know the orthodoxies, but teaching them orthodoxies through critical lenses, I think can be one way to kind of flip things upside down. Not only flipping the classroom, but flipping the syllabus in this sense. So this is the first decolonization, right? Getting away from these Western voices that tell, in political situations, that tell students in non-Western spaces, oh, you are the citizen of a non-democratic country, and this is what we've decided that you are, and this is the thing that's meaningful to you, when in reality that may not be very meaningful for their political experience at all. The second decolonization that comes in when we're talking about specific Eurasian contexts is decolonization away from Russia. And this has become something that's been more and more acknowledged recently. And it works on a couple of different layers. Certainly, the conversation since the invasion of Ukraine has really opened up a lot of spaces to talk about how our approach to Eurasia is Russia dominant, right? And how we really need to start giving more attention to non-Western or non-Russian kind of sources of knowledge in the Eurasian space. And so what this means is really just kind of prioritizing local voices that are outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg. If we're looking at Russian voices that are maybe indigenous or kind of minority voices in Russia, this is one level of decolonization within Russia, but also if we're looking at Central Asia or some of the other post-Soviet countries, just looking at not at how Russia sees them, but how they see themselves. And this is actually there's a lot of work left to be done in kind of pulling Central Asia, Caucasian, and other study areas away from the Russian sphere. I think it also acknowledges the sort of changing relationship that these countries have with Russia, again, catalyzed by the war in Ukraine, and looking at how things are changing. So this idea that Shoshana mentioned, that nations are fluid, right? These ideas are constantly changing. I think something that we really need to try to capture, right? Which also means that like a syllabus is not a historical document. document, right? It's a living document. So I find myself always changing my syllabus. And sometimes I think, why I'm just making my life so much harder because I'm, assigning new things all of the time. I'm always changing things. But in fact, I think that's what needs to happen, right? In terms of, we're always learning as teachers. We always need to be kind of integrating that learning back into the classroom so that we can show students how kind of model that learning process. The second thing I'll talk about is kind of just student-centered learning. And this is really quite generalizable to a lot of different contexts. So teaching students as whole people, really, right? Just like thinking about like, what is it that they're bringing into the classroom? What is it that they're bringing to their learning experience? What kind of experiences? What kind of traumas? And helping them to learn to trust themselves, learn to trust their own ability to think about the world. And really, this is really teaching to empower, right? And this, I think, is the heart of decolonization, learning to use our power as teachers to get under the experience of students to empower them to create knowledge themselves. So I'll give a little example of this in the Kazakhstani context, which really involved processing a lot of trauma over the last year. So if you know about Kazakhstan experienced its probably most politically traumatic event in January of 2022, when there were protests that kind of got out of control, lots of different interpretations about this. But people died and it was traumatic and the country was locked down. It was under a state of emergency and we didn't really have a lot of communication with the outside world and we didn't have a lot of communication with each other. And this was something that we had to unpack in the classroom because I couldn't allow my students to come into the classroom and not talk about this amazingly traumatic event that they had experienced. It wasn't very long after our January events that the invasion of Ukraine happened. And this was another trauma that just kind of started to pile on top of each other. And Kazakhstan experienced the war in Ukraine as a trauma because this is a sort of post-colonial solidarity. And also because we have even a larger border with Russia than Ukraine does, right? So there's always kind of the air of possibility. Another sort of trauma that happened was in September when they called for a partial mobilization, involuntary mobilization of Russian troops in Russia. And this sent a flood of hundreds of thousands of migrants into Kazakhstan, Russian migrants. And this created a crisis of national identity that is still going on in Kazakhstan. And these things can't be kept out of the classroom because these are the things that the students are really dealing with. And the fact that I teach politics and that I teach nationalism and national identity helps to kind of integrate these events into our curriculum. But it's also a part of just recognizing that students are in trauma and they need to unpack these if they're going to have any way of being able to move forward as citizens of their country. So I think that this, it's not, I mean, our experience was specific to traumas in Kazakhstan, but I think that the teaching of the whole person and the whole student with whatever they're bringing to the table is something that certainly we can see as a decolonizing principle across spaces and things like that. A third thing that I'll talk about, and it's related to this, is bringing in sort of activist spaces that we can integrate into our teaching. So this semester, I'm having students do a participatory action research project in our nationalism class, and this is partly because students really. Students and people in Kazakhstan more generally don't really have the language that they need to talk about the decolonization process and the changes in national identity, the sort of crisis of national identity that we're experiencing. All that we really have are kind of the government-defined categories to talk about these things. And that doesn't make for a very nuanced public discussion. And so what we're doing in the classroom is trying to give language to ourselves first, to counter those hegemonic sort of top-down national discourses, and to figure out what other language that we can use for belonging in Kazakhstan. So we have students kind of going out into the community and just asking people about their belonging without using this sort of state-defined language of ethnic groups, language categories, and these sorts of things that people use in ways that they don't necessarily think about, right? So this is again about kind of integrating that fluidity into our experience and trying to get new language to talk about it. So this is happening in the context of a class on nationalism, so the theme fits. But one of the things that we're really trying to interrogate in this classroom, in this semester, is whether decolonization overlaps with nationalism. And this is a really important discussion that needs to be had, and that we don't have the language to have. And so figuring out like how do we even talk about these ideas in ways that create new categories that we can use to talk with more nuance. And then I'll just say that even though this teaching, the teaching that I try to do is student-centered, it doesn't mean that we don't challenge our students. So especially when students are kind of a product of their environment, whether it's the American environment or whether it's the Kazakhstani environment, whether it's the Russian environment, all of these have their own peculiarities. Helping them to trust their own knowledge doesn't mean that we don't challenge them, right? Because often through these dialogues and these discourses, these are the ways that we learn. And I'm also a whole person too, right? If my students are whole people, I'm also a whole person. I have my biases, I have my opinions, and I actually don't keep those out of the classroom. I use those as kind of sparring tools with students, knowing that you are more than welcome to disagree with me. I invite you to disagree with me. I do not have a sort of my own, a sense of my own power that doesn't allow you to disagree with me. Please, I like this. But this is really important to kind of help students learn how to articulate their own positions, kind of argue their own positions, in maybe in dialogue with other people, including myself, and learn to kind of think outside of the categories that have been handed to them. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that we have plenty of time for Q&A, so maybe I'll turn it back over to Chris to start this Q&A process.
Well, thank you both so much for such interesting presentations and very diverse perspectives on this really challenging question that we have presented here in this session. Just a reminder to please go ahead and put any questions you have for Shoshana and Caress into the Q&A, and we'll discuss them. I wanted to talk a little bit, pick up on a thread that you mentioned, Caress, about inviting students into the actual conversation. And you mentioned, in the context of Kazakhstan, students are obviously dealing with political challenges on the ground there, impacts of the war in Ukraine, which obviously does have an impact, but a different kind of impact on an American student as well. But there's also the impact of the pandemic. And I've been talking to a number of educators, both at the high school level and at the college level, about how willing students are to really participate in conversation now post-pandemic. There being concerns about and some students being more comfortable with the online method of clicking on the answers and not necessarily sharing and being vulnerable, which is always generally a problem for younger people who are less certain of their beliefs and have less education behind them, and also a sense, particularly in the American context, of there being fear about being canceled, about saying the wrong thing and being on the wrong side potentially of an argument, and therefore being even less willing to be vulnerable. So how do you invite students into the conversation? This is a conversation that can be difficult even for adults and faculty to have about changing our understanding of this region. So how do you help bring the students themselves in so that it's really foundational to their understanding of this region?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, I think there's a lot that post-pandemic that we're really sorting out. I was a person that loved the pandemic, and actually coming out of the pandemic is much more traumatic than going into the pandemic. And I think I didn't really realize how that would be until a student said, we're really nervous about coming back to in-person classes. We didn't start in-person classes until the fall of this year. And the students said, we're really nervous about this. Like, what's it going to be? Like, we feel socially awkward, all of these things that we also feel as older adults. So yeah, this has been something that I think just like acknowledging your own kind of humanity is helpful. So like if I make a mistake or if I say something wrong, like I just acknowledge it, just to say, like I'm just a person, here I am, like with my own process and things like that. And I think by trying to be just approachable to students, they feel more comfortable to kind of share their ideas. So I really just try to create this environment that really demands their participation. So I mean, I have them kind of start with preparing discussion questions before they come to the class, so that I know even before we start the class session what things they're already thinking about. And then I can pull them in and I can say, oh, this person's question really helped me think about, this aspect of what we read today. And so that's a way of kind of already having some material that's prepared by the students to kind of help pull them in. That kind of breaks the ice a little bit. We don't have as much, well, I was gonna say we don't have as much of a cancel culture in Kazakhstan, but I think that's actually not true. Maybe we just cancel over different things. So yeah, I'm sure that there is some sort of policing, kind of self-policing in between, between the students as well. But I do, try to invite that debate by saying this is not necessarily a conflict. This is a dialogue, and we can't really learn without understanding different experiences. So, if you disagree with me or I disagree with you, I love that, right? And just telling students, really affirming those sorts of debates and openness and all of these sorts of things, I think is what I do personally.
Shoshana, do you have anything to add to that, or?
I don't think particularly. I'm dealing with a slightly different set of students, where at Hamilton we never broke, right? So we had live classes all the way through, although we did things like half the kids are in the room and the other half of the kids are coming in on Zoom. What we are starting to see now are the kids who essentially missed part of high school. And so I have now had students who do not know what a call number is on a library book. And I have to give them basic how to go to the library and find a book. I do find with Caress students who are not used to speaking up, right, in class conversation. And so, I'm trying to do a little more small group conversations, but even there, you've got the challenge of you have to walk around and make sure that everybody in fact is speaking, instead of having even the small groups dominated by one or two people. I think here, with teaching something that is far away from most students' personal experiences, Russian and Soviet history, the cancel culture issue is not as important. But it still can come up, and simply in the sense of, I'm afraid I'm going to say something wrong. In general, I try to go out of my way to be encouraging about, yes, you are confused. Yes, this is very difficult material. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It means this is very difficult material, and we're all wrestling with this together. Yeah, those are some of what I emphasize.
And frankly, the fact that the whole field is right now wrestling with how to teach about the field and understand the field is a reflection of that very same thing. That very smart people are dealing with their own confusion on these issues right now, right? That does lead me to one other question that I had, was about, our students, they don't come to us as blank slates, right? And you referenced this as well a little bit, Caress, but they come with their own learnings from their own previous education in high school or before, from their families, from the media, from news journalism. So how do you, luckily, like you said, Shoshana, they are Russian and Eurasian studies might be a little bit more of a blank slate. There might be a little bit less of an understanding of that you have to counter, but how do you sort of try and bring people back to a square one, even if that square one is right now sort of up for debate about what that should be.
I think I have one thought that immediately comes to mind is that I often let the students do this for each other. So again, my students are coming with different understandings. Some of them, watch Russian media. Some of them are kind of looking at Western media. There's a lot of, there's some, I try to be gentle with students and not completely say, and I've learned this over time, especially with young men, if I come in with a really kind of a counterpoint before I know them well, they really shut down. I mean, once I know them, it's fine. We can, we can spar a bit, but especially at the beginnings of those semesters, if I don't have a relationship with especially, certain, usually male students, then it can really be it can shut down conversations. But just kind of allowing students to kind of debate with each other, it takes me out of the the position where I kind of have to mediate, and that is interesting for them, right? Because it also teaches them how to dialogue with each other, which is a skill that they need to kind of take back into society. So that's my perspective on that.
I think the thing I would add to that when I'm teaching history is to really try and emphasize the humanity of the figures we're looking at. Right? Which can be difficult across many centuries, but these aren't just, flat legends, or, I have students who come to my classes because they have played video games that are built around historical stories about the Silk Road or other things. And it's good and it's bad, right? Because I really have to emphasize the full humanity of the figures we're studying as an entry point into the class, right? They're different, they have different values, but you're not looking at video game characters now. Right? You're looking at full people, and that can be one entry point. But it's you really have to pay attention to why they're in the class. I learned years ago I had to watch all the Disney kids movies because they're coming to the Russian class because they watched Anastasia.
Yeah.
So I have to know what the movie's about.
You have to know what narratives you're countering against, right?
Yeah.
All right, there's a question here for you, Shoshana. It says, historians in the US have, since the 1950s, been problematizing the nationalizing tendency of Russian historiography, a fact that's reflected in publications and course lecture notes from throughout the Cold War period. What evidence is there that historians in the West still fail to treat the history of Kiev and Rus or modern Ukraine in their own terms, especially after the imperial turn of the 1990s? Or is the problem that many of those now teaching Russian and Eurasian history were not trained in Muscovite and earlier history?
I think mostly the problem is the second point, right? That in graduate schools, we get and have gotten increasingly narrow training as the decades have gone on. And of course, there's good reasons for this. You need the language training, you need other things. But I know plenty of peers of mine. I am a specialist, in fact, in the Stalin period. That was my first book, who know everything there is to know about the Stalin period, but almost nothing about anything that's, say, earlier than the 1880s. And sometimes even that is a bit of a stretch. So I think one thing we need to do is, again, to broaden training in graduate schools. The other thing, though, is we see this in our textbooks, we see this in the common narrative, this habit of talking about the entire thing, the entire Russian Empire, the entire Soviet Union as Russia. And I do it myself. I still catch myself in lectures, how Russia defeated the Nazis at Stalingrad. It's a deeply ingrained habit. And I think it's partly because it's easy. We've got one nation, one state to talk about. We sort of plug in Ukrainians or maybe plug in Kazakh people into this central narrative. And that's what we need to break up. That's what the challenge is.
Yeah, I mean, it almost wonders how much of it is a challenge of language, right? And the human condition of trying to just generalize for understanding, but not without realizing, of course, what the implications of that generalization can be.
Well, Caress brought in the question of, do we have a language for this? And this is
Yes.
something I've been wrestling with because I teach the history of Russia and the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union. That still is centering Russia. But if I say, well, I teach the histories of the peoples of Western Eurasia,
Mhm.
nobody knows what I'm
That
talking
means,
about.
yeah.
So true.
So there's a question here for you, Caress, about one of the tips that you said that you use in your classroom, which is to use the color coding on your syllabus. And the question is, if you can really equate white male to stand in as a colonizing voice and non-white male, or for local to stand in for a decolonizing voice, how do you begin to assign sort of social identity categories with any certainty?
No, I think that's a great question. And I mean, I think that any sort of color coding or categorization is a starting place for a conversation. I think it's not necessarily it's not necessarily yeah, I can't categorize somebody. I mean, yeah, maybe you could categorize the content of their article as a decolonized versus more kind of hegemonic position, because exactly right, especially when people go to the West to get their PhDs, they come out with all the same sorts of knowledge paradigms as the sort of Western hegemonic academic ways of thinking. And yeah, in that sense, is their perspective really decolonized? Is it local? Those are perfect questions, and questions that we should always be having a conversation about. So I fully agree with the criticism. And I think it's just by color coding, though, I think it's a way of starting that conversation. And if there's other ways of starting the conversation, I'm always open to other methods and ideas as well.
Yeah, I do think it's important to at the very least have a little bit of accountability, right, about what you're putting on the syllabus, like you said, that it's not a historical document, it's not syllabi are not carved in stone, and to think every year about who are my students hearing from and hearing about. And it is a good trick to use to try and make sure that the syllabi becomes a real living document and a changing and growing reflection of voices in our field. Yeah. Shoshana, are there any tips or tricks that you have been using that could help aid this conversation, or a reflection of the practices you've been putting into place in the classroom?
Yeah, I haven't tried the color coding my syllabus, although I certainly agree that the syllabus is a living document, and very much I change it all the time, bring in new issues all the time. I tend to think in terms of texts that we can use to help students see the multiplicity of these states. So I can put in a plug for what I think is a marvelously helpful article for the Great Reforms period by a German historian named Stefan Kirmse on how Crimean and Volga Tatars were making use of the reformed courts, right, in the 1870s, right, as they bring in jury trials and lawyers. And I think Kirmse provides a really good model for many of the things we've talked about, that he bases his analysis on accounts by Tatars, right, using the courts. He gets the court records, and so here's this woman bringing a suit, and he has a multi-angled focus. It can be easy to fall into a narrative of, okay, now we're decolonizing, so now we're going to talk about the opposition against the big evil state. And Kirmse makes it much more complicated, right? Here are Tatars who go to the Russian Reformed courts against their own community when they think that the Reformed court is going to give them a better deal. So he brings in the way that power is complicated. So I'm always hunting for texts that do this. When we get back again into the early period, I think something else we're going to need to do is turn back more to literature than we are accustomed to doing in history. Folk tales, not only the Russian Bulini, there are Tatar folk tales, there are Jewish sources, Jewish tales that again can complicate our understanding of the power dynamics, even when we're in the Russian Empire, right? I mean, Peter the Great himself lamented he didn't have nearly as much control as he thought he should. There are also new points of focus that I think we need. Getting away from the two capitals, going to places like Astrakhan, which turned out to be a big international open trade door for the Russian Empire. People came there from Central Asia, they came from Persia, some came from as far as India. And that's, again, one of the challenges we're going to have going into the future is we need new text translated. We need new research done. And right now that's almost impossible to do, at least not in Russia. We're going to have to, go back to the methods of the 1950s and the 1960s in trying to create new historical narratives.
Mm-hmm. It's a really excellent point when you think about decentering, the fact that Russia is not a place right now where graduate students can go and do their work and faculty can go and conduct research, how that is going to impact the way that we think about this field. Yeah. Sorry, Russ, go ahead.
Well, I think this is a great opportunity to send our graduate students to other places. So sending them to Kazakhstan is a great idea. We would be happy to have them.
No bias.
But I agree with Shoshana on this idea of complexity, right? And some of this, sometimes this is very anti-disciplinary. So in my discipline in political science, the goal is to simplify often. And so we have to push against our sort of disciplinary trends to really give a sort of accurate and human, like you said, perspective on, the things that are going on around us in the past and in the present. So I think that this is really, really important.
Okay, we're almost at the end of our time. Any concluding remarks or points to share before we wrap up?
I guess I would just say, I think that this is, I think allowing ourselves to be human as teachers, right? And just saying like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't grade your exams because I just feel really stressed out. and I'm going to give you an extension, right? I mean, just bringing our humanity into the classroom, I think also teaches students, especially university students who are at a really delicate age, teaches them to accept their humanity, right? This is also an important way of empowering students. That has nothing to do with curriculum or decolonizing, except it does, right? Because like if we're teaching our students to trust themselves and trust their own human experience, then this is really like just being a mess in front of them, I think is okay. We don't have to have this, sort of, I'm the expert and, you should trust me and my ideas sort of perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my only final comment would be, again, for historians, that we, think in less teleological terms. Our old questions were, how did Moscow rise? Or how did the Bolshevik Revolution happen? Right? What were the alternatives that might have happened? And think much more open-endedly about the interactions of all of these peoples across all of this region, not just one state, but getting away from a state structure and thinking more in terms of interactions of peoples.
And frankly, like Caress too, building on your point about asking your students themselves to prepare questions in advance. We could learn a lot from what our students' questions are and not just the kinds of questions we ourselves have been asking, right? Well, thank you both so much for this fascinating discussion. Obviously, a lot more to say about this, and hopefully we have lots of opportunities to discuss it in person and online into the future. And so just as a reminder, as we close, that our next final panel of the series, Decolonization in Focus, will happen 2 weeks from now on Friday, March 31st at 12 noon. The topic of that session will be the future of CEAS expertise. How can we anticipate tomorrow's differences? That session will be led by Juliet Johnson from McGill University with presentations from Ararat Ossipian of the New University in Exile Consortium, with Ilya Gerasimov from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Sergei Yakelchik from the University of Victoria. And we hope to see you then. And thank you again for joining us today. Take care.